Welcome, everybody, to 3 Point Range. This is the Professor Tim Crothers, along with the Scout Kimmel Crosley and the Prospect Shelby Swanson. And once again, we find ourselves with a theme episode. I think when we started the podcast way back in the early 19th century, we never really envisioned that there would be theme episodes. We all thought we'd just be running off on our own points wildly, randomly. But the last two episodes, including this one, are going to end up revolving around a single sport, in this case, pucks of all things, hockey. I don't know if 2 weeks ago, if you told me that I'll be talking about hockey today, I would have believed you. And I don't know if 4 weeks ago, if you told me that we'd be talking about the Four Nations Cup, I probably would have said, what's the Four Nations Cup? So it just goes to show that sometimes in sports, we have what I like to call a phenomenon. This was a phenomenon.
Phenomenon.
Absolutely. Well, your point might be a phenomenon, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So yeah, you just don't get the phenomenons very often, and I do think it's worth diving in as deeply as possible. When you do, I guess, the value of being old and gray is that I do have the benefit of history, and I know that, I know when phenomenons occur and how rarely they occur. The best one I can think of, and Kimball, you remember this was before the Prospect was born, but the best example of this that I can remember from my sporting fandom was the 1999 Women's Soccer World Cup. That tournament began with zero fanfare, and there was just nothing. It was just okay. It was in the U.S. and nobody had really paid attention to it ever before. It had been 2 World Cups before, and no one paid any attention to the Women's World Cup. And then all of a sudden, it starts to build a little momentum, and people start paying a little bit more attention to it. And yes, there were some big stars, Mia Hamm, Christine Lilly, and Brianna Scurry, and all these people that those in the sports world knew who they were. But it started gaining momentum. I use that word proudly. It started gaining momentum. And by the time we got to the final, U.S. versus China, there were 40 million people watching that game. By far the most to ever watch a women's soccer game. And I just remember thinking about it as I was watching the Four Nations Cup and thinking, maybe on a slightly smaller scale this time around, but that there was a similarity to this idea that it was just an event that came out of nowhere. It was an event that nobody was paying attention to, and then all of a sudden, everybody seemed to be paying attention to it. The Women's World Cup was just through the roof. The next week, the Women's World Cup and their team was on the cover of Time, on the cover of Newsweek, on the cover of People magazine, and on the cover of Sports Illustrated, all at the same time. It was a phenomenon. And the consensus was that because of this, it would extend to, things beyond the World Cup. So I remember we were talking about it at the time and thinking, wow, they got to get a pro league started because this is the moment. They got to take advantage of this. Well, and sure enough, they did get a pro league started. They started the WUSA, the Women's United Soccer Association, and all the World Cup players played in it. And everybody thought it would be awesome, and it folded 3 years later. And since then, every time we have another World Cup, people seem to get all excited about it. The U.S. wins the World Cup pretty much all the time. And so every time we think, okay, this is going to be a boost to the professional league. And so when we won the 2011 World Cup, huge boost, we thought, for the Women's Professional Soccer League, which took over for the WUSA, the Whoops. And the Whoops lasted 3 seasons, and it was done. And now they have the National Women's Soccer League. And when we won the World Cup, most recent World Cup, everybody thought, well, that'll be a help. Well, will this be the spark, maybe? Maybe this will be the spark. And sure enough, I watched the most recent World Cup with great interest. But I haven't watched any NWSL games since, not one. And I think there's a reason why the Olympics and the World Cup are so popular. This is it. And why the Four Nations Cup was so popular. People care more about country versus country than they do city versus city. I mean, it's just not the same thing. U.S. versus Canada, I'm in. It was great. But then the next week, and I'm making this matchup up, but Anaheim versus Dallas in the NHL, not so much. Not in. And so I guess at the risk of being playing this down and being a Debbie Downer, I think we need to pump the brakes on this idea. You know, I've heard so many people say, "Oh, the NHL is just going to ride this wave," and all of a sudden it's going to become virally popular. And I'm going to say that we've seen this movie before in other sports, and we need to be careful about assuming that this fervor that was created over country versus country is whether or not that's really going to extend to just the real league. I mean, I just haven't seen it yet, and I don't expect to see it. And as much as I loved the Four Nations Cup, and it was awesome, and I'd love for it to come back again, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference in terms of where it takes its the national sport, our NHL. At this point, you all may commence telling me how right I
am. I do think you're very right here. And I think it's especially so in the NHL, right? Because it feels like, I don't even know the numbers, but it feels like, are 90% of these guys foreigners? I mean, maybe 10%? Maybe that's high. Americans.
Did bro say 90 or 10?
Wait a minute. In the NHL, how many are Americans? I don't know the answer to that, but it's more than 10%.
Right. Okay. So I wonder how much it is. I mean, what the percentage is.
Okay,
I mean,
hold on. Wait, go on. I'll have some data.
She'll figure it out.
I'll figure it out.
Anyway, you figure it out. But that's not, but that's neither here nor there. But I think it's a fascinating.
I think it's like 29.1%.
Okay, 29.1. So, okay, and so I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference certainly there, especially since they're all on different teams, and I don't think many people even know, and it's not easy to identify them as different. But it did make me think about some of the other phenomenon from our lifetimes, Tim. Maybe not from Shelby's, but I was thinking, and then I was trying to think of a theme here. So I'm going to say Sosa McGuire was a phenomenon.
Yep.
That seemed to transcend sports. Like all of a sudden, you're a baseball person, all of a sudden these non-baseball people are coming up to you and saying like, "Hey," and you're like, "Really? You want to talk about Sosa McGuire?"
Mm-hmm.
Tanya Harding.
Okay.
Nancy Kerrigan.
Yep.
I think that was a big one.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought you were going to go way back to the Battle of the Sexes, Riggs. Bobby Riggs.
Yep.
And Billie Jean King.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because if you think about those things, I mean, Sosa McGuire, that's a little touchy one, whether there's a difference there. But some might say the American versus Dominican. But then, of course, Tanya Harding, you're saying like, typical figure skating class as opposed to non-typical figure skating class.
With Nancy Kerrigan, yes.
Yes, exactly. And Battle of the Sexes. So I don't know if that's part of it when you get a natural, where people can really gravitate to one side or the other. That's part of it. But I think you're dead on right. I don't know how this would, generate much momentum for the NHL. And momentum does exist in things like this, but just not in gameplay in sports. Go ahead, Shelby.
Momentum. I would say, honestly, I'm going to push back on this, and I would say that, I mean, again, only time will tell in terms of how much of a, impact this has on the NHL, but I think it really did end up being a greater success than professional organized hockey could have hoped for in terms of increased viewership and exposure. A really hype game in the middle of an otherwise kind of dead sports calendar period. Really fresh alternative to the All-Star game. We talked about that with the NBA All-Star game. You might remember that I kind of proposed doing a US versus world thing. Mm-hmm. Hey, and then also
you got to think that's coming, right? I mean,
it's got to be, especially after I think the Court of Gold documentary on Netflix and all the hype that's surrounded that. But yeah, I mean, I think it was an average of, and not all the data is in, but from what they have so far, 4.6 million viewers for the round robin games and over 10 million for the USA-Canada matchup. That 10 million average viewers across North America is more than any non-Stanley Cup final since 2014. And I think...
What was the biggest viewership of any hockey game ever on ESPN?
There you go. Mm-hmm. There you go. And obviously, there have been kind of just some issues in terms of lockouts, and that's kind of had an impact on TV viewership numbers. But I think the biggest thing is going to be kind of what the scout was hitting on in terms of a familiarity in terms of US born players. Because again, based on a quick Google search, I think about basically a third, roughly 29-30% of NHL players are actually US born. And also, can we find players that we identify with from the NHL in the Winter Olympics, right? Because that's one of the big, I guess, selling points about this Four Nations event was that, it's supposed to drum up, excitement for the upcoming Winter Olympics.
And it will, I believe that.
Okay, here's the thing, though, is that in terms of, how does that impact the NHL? Mm-hmm. My understanding is that NHL players did not play in the 2018 or 2022 Winter Olympics.
Right, but they're supposed to play in the next one.
So I think that's, I mean, I don't know. I think this could drum up excitement, but only time will tell what that crossover impact is, because you don't have any, again, I don't have anything to go off of 2018,
if you
2022.
want to do some real crack research,
okay,
and go back and research this, Shelby, before your lifetime again, the Miracle on Ice, that might be, and I'm going to say, first of all, it's not the same, because these are already NHL players, so it's like, hey, look who's coming in the NHL. But I wonder if there was a bump in the NHL after Miracle on Ice, because several of those players went on to have great NHL careers. And I know, at least when I'd see Ken Morrow, right, I believe I'm getting his name right.
Yeah.
I'd be like, oh yeah, him.
Right. But is Ken Morrow changing the viewership in the NHL?
Well, I wondered if it gave it that's what I'm saying. I bet you if you did some research, the NHL got a minor bump from the players that then transferred over from, to playing for that great U.S. team to then playing in the NHL. And then it was probably only a minor bump, and it was short-lived. I don't think there's going to be really any bump here, because it's not that. And that was big.
Yeah. And back to Shelby's point, part of the reason why the Four Nations Cup was so popular is because the NHL players didn't play in those last two Olympics. So this was the first time since 2016 that we'd gotten to see country versus country in hockey. And we are supposed to see it again at the 2026 games. And I do believe that there will be a bit of a coattails involved in this. I do think people will be fired up for that. Mm-hmm. And it'll be even better because there'll be even more countries playing in it. I mean, you hope that ultimately it'll end up with a U.S.-Canada rematch, because that would be, that's what made this. I mean, if you think about if it had ended up being Canada against Finland or Canada against Sweden,
it's just not we
wouldn't be talking about this right now.
Especially, I think, with kind of the political tensions going on between the two.
You mean the 51st state?
Well, yeah. I mean, well, anyways, we don't have to go too into it, but I mean, you've seen at recent games between like teams of the two nations. Like, I'm trying to remember, what was the game where the national anthem was being booed?
That was the first game, the U.S.-Canada first game up in Montreal.
Yeah, there you go. So I mean, I think that certainly has to add to it, and just everything that's going on with these tariffs and everything. Not to get too much into it, but yeah, I think the biggest thing too is going to be, can they parlay this into a really, really exciting Winter Olympics matchup? And then it's about riding the coattails of that excitement and further investing in youth programs like, the junior canes and things like that, and trying to build up, I guess, a more like prosperous youth kind of program, because I think that's one of the big things that has potentially damaged the NHL. And I'm not saying it's right, but a lack of familiarity of, oh yeah, like I'm watching this guy who's from my state, or from, I don't know, some kind of familiarity with just US born
Right.
talent. Americans want to watch Americans, for better or for worse, and I think that's something that they kind of have to address.
And let's be honest, I don't know whether you all were watching that first game in Montreal, but the reason that I got hooked, and the reason that a lot of people got hooked, was because they had 3 fights in the first 9 seconds of the game.
Oh, we'll get to some fighting too. We'll get to a fighting take later on.
That is not something
Stay
that
tuned.
anybody was expecting, and I think that was the spark. That's what brought everybody in. What the heck is going on? And I don't. It still hasn't been properly explained to me exactly why that happened. I mean, some people think it was the booing of the national anthem. I think it was just the Americans just wanting to prove that they weren't going to be intimidated by the Canadian team in Canada. Whatever it was, that was theater. That's why this thing, that was the spark that lit this, and then it's kind of blew up from there. I will say real quick before we move on that I do think that there is a viewership void to be filled in American sports. And this is totally self-serving, but, I think the fact that Draymond Green is acknowledging what I've been saying for a long time in these podcasts, that the NBA is boring, his word and mine, is an opening. I think that the fact that MLB right now is not going to be broadcast by ESPN after this year is significant. I think, hockey's a fun watch. There is an opportunity there, but I just don't feel like, if it's city versus country versus country, I think that's not going to get us over the hump. We'll see. Anyway, moving on. Point 2. Scout, what you got?
All right, so in that game, the one we're referring to, the finals of the Four Nations Trophy or Cup or whatever they want to call it, who were you guys rooting for?
That's a fascinating question. I am sort of famous in my household for rooting against the Americans and things like the Ryder Cup and stuff, because I think they're just pampered, spoiled brats, and so I think the U.S., I mean, the Europeans are just much more of a fun route. This one I struggled. I think, at the risk of getting into political things, which Shelby seems to be sidestepping, I didn't want a certain person who would have taken credit for our victory with some ridiculous talk about his pep talk before the game to get credit for us winning. So ultimately, that came down to my making my final decision, and I was slightly favoring Canada.
Yeah,
Shelby?
I would say for the most part, I was favoring the U.S. just because, I am an American, and, hot take. But I see where, Tim's coming from in terms of the not wanting a certain someone to claim credit. But more so than that, I was just kind of rooting for, Seth Jarvis and Jacob Slavin, the 2 Hurricanes. Seth Jarvis playing for Canada, Slavin playing for the U.S., and just kind of watching them throughout the game was interesting. But then when it's got to the end and it was tied going into extra time, I'm I was hoping for a USA goal at that point.
So she was in fact rooting for her geography there, Tim. She was rooting for Carolina Hurricanes.
Well, no, because Jeff Jarvis is Canadian, so it was a 1-1 for the. Oh, what you're saying? She was rooting for the Canes. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
One on each team, which can be a tough route. All right. Well, you guys might not want to go all in there, but I am going all in. I was 100% rooting for Canada. I went from, and it's interesting with your point, Tim, in a 48-hour span, I went from not knowing what the heck the Four Nations Cup was to it was one of the more important sporting events I can remember.
You texted me from the road. You texted me from the road asking me what was going on, and I was so caught up in it, I wasn't even willing to text you back because I didn't want to take my focus away. I mean, it was in overtime at that point, I think.
I can't believe how all in I was, and as you said, like, so I couldn't watch the game because I had to drive. I was driving a long 4-hour drive from Rhode Island to New York, and you know, I started the drive right before the game began, and I thought I'll just listen to it on the radio. It'll help me on the drive. Could not find it on the radio, talking about the popularity of NHL or hockey even. And I was like, come on, someone must be. And I thought, well, that's what a pop-up event it is. No one thought people would care. Like, I can't find it on any station. And I don't have XM radio or anything, but I was trying to like AM, FM, and just doing the painful thing and going through the dial, but I could not find it. I was dying, you know, and so my girlfriend Sarah, a huge hockey fan, I would call her, but she started watching behind, and so I didn't want to like ruin her experience by doing that. And so I was just like, and I was dying, and it was so frustrating. The updates, you know, trying to, do I stick with the station just so occasionally they'll mention the score? But yes, I was all in, and so much of that was politics. I am not afraid to say, like, come on, I was not going to root for the U.S. for that reason. But then I go, well, you know, I'm not proud right now of our nation. It's not just for that guy, but for the fact that so many people are pro that guy, and that makes it really hard for me to be like, yeah, go America. I love who we are. Whereas Canada, like, you know, look, I've never lived there. I don't know. I've been there, but of course I don't know. And I've known Canadians. I used to work for the Blue Jays, but it seems like they got it going in terms of this type of thing, politics and kindness and whatever you want to call it, you know. Kindness. I'm telling you, it comes down to kindness.
Don't forget the poutine. They've got poutine.
It comes down to humanity, really. If you think about it, that's why I think kindness is important. But
kindness is important, guys.
But no, but
come back for more.
But to transition, well, I think it's underestimated. But to transition, I wonder if all that political stuff was not going on. Who, you know, going back to sort of Tim's idea, and I was interesting, Tim, that you even said that you often root. I was very interested to hear who you would say, because I know you often root for the best story. And you know, who's decided which side of the story was this way. But so it was interesting to hear you say that, admit that you often root against the U.S., and I think you often root against the U.S. for the same reason I do. That there's some idea of like who deserves it more. Like, who do I want to see win? Do I want to see, you know, the spoiled ones, whatever sport it is, or do I want to see, you know, not necessarily the underdog, but the person that deserved it, that needs it, that worked hardest for it? And so I think back to different things, and I was trying to figure out, like, why was I so easily against U.S.? Am I not a patriot at all? And I think, you know, it's interesting, like basketball. I was thinking back on the history of my basketball fandom in terms of this kind of thing. And of course, basketball in a funny way is my favorite sport. It's the sport I played when I grew up, was growing up. And I was thinking how much pride I had when USA was starting to fail on the international scene in basketball. And now it's just like, come on, this is our game. Just like the Canadians, it's our game. We can't lose to them, you know. But then it was funny because even as that transition, especially when we were playing our amateurs against the pros, boy, did I say, like, come on, let's have even our 19-year-olds going up against the 30-year-olds win. But then when it turned...
You're talking about Miracle on Ice.
No. Well, I'm talking still basketball. I'm talking about, like, my transition of basketball, like, and why it changes. So then I became almost anti-U.S. after a while when it became, like, not I love the Dream Team because that was talk about a phenomenon, Tim. That was actually think about that
Yep.
phenomenon,
Mm-hmm.
and that was amazing because and I just think that happened to be an era where we had just such a great collection of fascinating players.
Yep.
Bird, Jordan, Magic, Barkley. I mean, it's amazing. Ewing.
Yep.
So Mullen. So anyway, uh, but then when it turned, and now we're just sending like the pros that kind of like, okay, I'll go, and we're gonna
Right.
kick ass. And then it's
Absolutely
like,
root against the U.S. in the Olympics
right,
every
and then
time. Can't
right,
stand it. Ugh.
right, and then you're rooting for the team that actually plays team basketball and is organized, not just running up and down and not trying to block every shot, but taking charges. And so then that switched. It was funny. It just goes back and forth, and you have the Miracle on Ice. And I was even thinking, it's the same idea when it came to the conclusion that I kind of root for the team that deserves it the most. And I was most patriotic, and the team that I wanted to win most, that unfortunately didn't, was you go to USA Soccer, Bobby Bradley, and it was partly, we know his brothers, right, Tim?
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, and uh, and so they were UNC people, and we knew them, and they both have interesting sporting careers themselves. But it wasn't just that I knew of their coach and whatever. The way they played, that when they were trying to win, they were trying to win with this real style of soccer that was like, we're not going to flop, we're not going to do all the histrionics, we're just going to play hard. And of course, it didn't work in the end. They didn't get there. But that team. So I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you end up rooting for country? Do you end up? I mean, I guess Tim's already answered, but Shelby, I guess you root for Hurricanes and Carolina people. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say like just as you were kind of talking about that, the thing that I think about is um the South Sudan men's basketball team. I think that's a great example of a time that I was definitely rooting against the USA in that
Yep.
exhibition basketball
Absolutely.
game. It ended up being a LeBron James layup with 8 seconds left, go ahead basket. And this was in again an exhibition game, sort of ahead of the Olympics. Then South Sudan ended up making a stunning run, but I mean, for context, and a lot of people kind of remember how this team really captured the world's attention. I still think it was a relatively overlooked story, but I mean, South Sudan, obviously, relatively new nation. I believe they gained independence in 2011, but I mean, just talk about ultimate symbol of hope, pride, underdog story.
Right. I mean, that's such an underdog story.
I mean,
That's
it's
what
insane.
you're talking
Like
about.
you talk about this team led by former NBA player and current, I think, Houston assistant coach, Royal Ivy. Um, Started 4 years ago, about, I guess it would have been like around 2020 ish. And at the time, I mean, South Sudan had basically no indoor basketball facilities. Like it's crazy. And obviously like a lot of the guys that you're seeing are former NCAA NBA players with like a heritage there. And JT Thor, you also saw the youngest star, 17-year-old Kaman Malawach, and that's kind of how I was introduced to him now, obviously at Duke. But it was just a super, super inspiring story, very inspiring to the nation's youth, and a lot of the players talked about that, and also talked about trying to kind of change the global perception of some of the stereotypes around South Sudan. So if you look at just that game and how well that team was performing against this, greatest of all time, Team USA, heck yeah! I mean, I was rooting for South Sudan.
Right.
That's a way better story, and it's way more impressive considering um, just sort of all the geopolitical context, and also the just facilities and what they have access to. So that's kind of the most notable thing off the top of my head.
I mean, that's why they made a movie about the Miracle on Ice, is because it had the two elements that we all find irresistible: one, country versus country, and then massive underdog. I mean,
There you go.
the U.S. was just such a massive underdog against the best team in the world at that time, the Soviets. That I think that's what captured everybody's attention. But I mean, just to put a wrap on the Four Nations Cup, you talked about this rooting for the story, Kimmel, and I think that's one of the reasons why it was such a beautiful, poetic finish is the game was won in overtime on a goal by Connor McDavid, who I think, and most people agree, is the best player in the world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the
And
face of hockey right
yeah,
now.
he is.
Yeah.
He is the face of hockey, but he is kind of he's unknown to Americans because he plays in the backwater of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which we hardly ever actually get a chance to see him. And all of a sudden, here he is. We get a chance to see the Connor McDavid, this guy who's just really a ghost who just puts up all these stats, but you don't ever actually see him.
I couldn't tell you what he looked like.
Right. And I'd never heard him speak until I listened to the post game interview. But yes, he, the mantle was passed from Sidney Crosby, the greatest player in the world in his time, winning the last U.S. game last time this game had kind of been played, on a goal and I think it was in overtime, and then passed the torch to Connor McDavid, who does it in this particular game. I mean, it just when you say root for the story, that was about as good a story as you could get. Anyway, we'll move on. Keeping the puck theme working, go for it.
There you go. So, guys, my take is, okay, if men can fight in hockey, why shouldn't women? Okay, stick with me here. So, guys, the first fight in professional women's hockey league history just went down this past Thursday, and it was awesome. Okay, I'm not going to play the video because I've gotten in trouble for doing like playing videos and stuff in the past. Our audio producer doesn't want us sued, but so basically the two characters you need to know, it's Boston Fleet forward Jill Saunier and Ottawa Charges Teresa Vanisheva. They got tangled up in a third period scrap. They're throwing punches through their cages, and honestly, I don't really get why fighting is allowed in men's hockey but not women's. Let me explain. So the PWHL, for those who don't know, is in its second season ever. Relatively new professional women's league. It's got a lot of people excited. But this marks the first fight in PWHL history, and I think there is a slight reason why maybe it might have taken a little bit longer. So in NHL, obviously, we all know fighting is pretty much part of the culture, and it's penalized with, my understanding, is about a 5-minute major penalty, but players aren't automatically ejected, and it's kind of expected. Meanwhile, PWHL rule number 46 dictates specifically that fighting is not part of the PWHL's game. Players shall be penalized accordingly, may be ejected. Luckily, and I guess because there's no like precedent there, both players just received roughing penalties. They weren't ejected.
Really?
For Vanish, which I was like, that's electric. For Vanisheva, this is just for you PWHL nerds out there, this adds to her league-leading penalty minutes. Love that. Okay, but then on top of that, she scored a goal, and she had an assist. That makes her the first player in PWHL history to complete the Gordie Howe hat trick,
Right.
okay?
So she's not just a goon.
No, but she backs it up, right? But also, like, if you just look at how the league kind of behaves around any, and this is the first, like, I would say, fights, but any sort of roughing, things like that, the league cuts away from the fights on broadcast. The NHL, I mean, it's replaying it in slow motion, right? It's sending out those highlights. But why? Why is it treated differently?
Right.
Fighting is bad, then it's bad for men's and women's leagues. But if it's part of the game, I think it should be part of the game for everyone. Because for better or for worse, hockey is a physical sport. And fighting, whether you love it or you think it's ridiculous, I can only imagine where Draymond Green might weigh in here. It's something fans expect. So I don't really want this to be a question of whether, like, should fighting exist in hockey. But my take is, I want you guys to weigh in. I think as long as it is allowed and celebrated in the men's game, there is no reason that the women should not get the same treatment.
Are you saying that they cut away from the fight on the broadcast?
Yeah.
That's unbelievable. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So speaking of another phenomenon, the Broad Street Bullies, right, Tim?
Yes.
When Shelby doesn't know, there was the hockey team in our lifetime. So am I going to the 70s or the 80s, Tim? I guess I'm going to the 70s, aren't I?
I don't know. Yeah.
I think so. Bobby Clark and they were this great hockey team, but they were like, it was like Slapshot. They just, like, by far were the most penalized team in the NHL. And I want to go back and watch the games. And so like, I'm sorry, you just can't get that many penalties and be successful. I mean, are you the greatest penalty killers ever? Like, if you lead the league in shorthanded goals, but it was crazy, and it was a time when you think fighting's allowed now. No, they've trimmed way down on fighting. In that era, it was like the movie Slapshot. It was just one Donnybrook after another, and we're going to a time where people didn't have helmets, so it was
people went to the games for the fights. They didn't go for the games. They went to the
no
games
question.
for the fights.
And so to answer your question, yeah, if first of all, a league that I've never heard of, an acronym that you texted me, and I was like, what is that? I'm trying to think, are you talking bowling this week? Mm-hmm. What are you talking about? And so, yeah, don't cut away from it. Lean into it, because face it, women fighting is popular. I don't watch the stupid fighting things we have now. What is it called?
MMA?
But of course, the women boxers must be very popular, because I see as much sort of news or come across as much information about them as they do the men. So I would think, yeah, embrace it.
Yeah. I think it's, just my understanding of what I've been able to find is that it's pretty much like a policy to cut or redirect the cameras, and because by the rules, they probably should have been ejected. And my understanding is that with that and all the rules that it's written into body checking is, the intent, people will say, is to give leeway and give players a better chance to show their skills. But I think it's also because they really, especially in that first season, again, like this being, you went an entire season without any fights, they really wanted to decentivize players from doing this. Maybe it's more, they thought, like, marketable if, our players aren't acting brutish. Again, like, I'm just kind of theorizing here. But I don't think they have to worry about that, because from what I've seen, I mean, I think the PWHL, and obviously it's not had great crossover success, but in terms of a league in its infancy, it has proved people do want to watch women's hockey. They just, I think about a month ago, set a U.S. women's hockey attendance record at the Denver's Ball Arena. It was about like 14,000 fans there. And again, this is nothing crazy, but that's a record for a women's hockey game in the U.S. And I mean, when you think about just the status of women's hockey right now, like, I know some girls that are on the UNC kind of women's club team, and they've had difficulty not only just recruiting enough people to start that club, but literally they just talked to me about being able to find women's gear, that like fits their bodies. Like, I think the US is just so far behind in where women's hockey is at. So
are there other countries that are way ahead?
I mean, I just don't think, like, I don't think women's hockey is like the national phenomenon that like men's hockey is. But if you look at just like popularity of like hockey in this country compared to like a Canada, like on the women's side, like I would say, yes, the US is behind. But yeah, I don't know. Did you want to weigh in?
I mean, my feeling, yes, I've 100% agree that that's ridiculous that they're cutting away. I mean, it seems sexist almost in some way. And I feel like we wouldn't be having, as I said earlier, we wouldn't be having this podcast right now talking about this subject if it weren't for those fights at the beginning of the Four Nations Cup. If they had cut away from those fights, I mean, there would have been a revolt. I mean, that was a piece of that story, and we needed to see it. We needed to try to understand why it was going on. And same thing I would say for a women's game. It's kind of, it just seems ridiculous to me. And honestly, one of the crazy things about NHL popularity is I think there are a lot of NHL fans, and you're, as a Canes fan, you can confirm or deny this. I think there's a lot of NHL fans that would like to have the fighting back.
Yes.
I feel like they miss it.
I'm with it.
They miss it. It was always part of the game. It was never a useful part of the game. I mean, it was always just a sideshow, in my opinion. And I don't feel like, it was ever part of the strategy of the game, but the fact is, it was the circus. It was part of the circus. And now that they've essentially legislated it out of the game, it is a different game. And there are a lot of fans, I think, who would welcome more fighting in the game. Not that it's a good thing in any way, but I do think that's a fact. And I'd be curious to see what the ratings would be like. I mean, just to put it in context, 10 million people, we said, watch the Four Nations Cup final. The average NHL game on ESPN is about 500,000. And so, it's not a hugely popular sport. And maybe Gary Bettman needs to look into this, bring a few more goons back into the game, and see if we can pump the ratings a little bit.
There you go.
Kimball, anything else?
No, I'm good.
All right. Well, then...
I should say that this is probably our final podcast because there's a certain guy working in the government, Elon Musk, that's going to hear this podcast and shut it down pronto after hearing
you
some
think
things
so?
that we're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a hunch that we might be good. But...
Well, if you listen to our executive producer and she tells you what our ratings are like, I think we're going to be fine.
Again, shout out to all our listeners, but I think we might still be, underground enough that we should be able to slide.
Just takes one.
Hopefully, he has some bigger things on his plate, like
oh my God!
Gutting the entire
Eject.
Okay,
Eject.
We'll stop.
Eject.
We'll stop.
Thanks to our student marketing guru, logo designer, newsletter writer, and studio audience, Celia Funderburg. Thanks to our student executive producer and ratings hawk, Sarah Ellis. And so for the prospect, Shelby Swanson, and the scout, Kimball Crossley, I am the professor, Tim Crothers, pulling up from the top of the key for a heat check from 3. Good.